All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for being here this evening with us. My name is Olivia Reilly. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the Human Evolutionary Biology Department at Harvard University. I'm here tonight with Dr. Hecht, who will be helping to field questions. So there will be a live Q&A at the end of this webinar, but if you have questions throughout any part of the talk, feel free to drop them in the chat, and then hopefully I'll be able to get to them at the end, and hopefully we'll have time. So I'm excited to talk to you this evening about kids, canines, and the science of social attachment. Um, I should also mention that this webinar is being recorded. So if you know anybody that is interested in hearing about the topic but was not able to make it at this time of day, we can send a link out for those who are interested. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So here is an outline of what you can expect from tonight's presentation. So I'm going to start by talking about how dogs are important to people, but I'm also going to talk about why dogs are important for kids, not just human adults, but kids as well. I will then talk about the importance of relationship quality in social attachment and social bonding, specifically relationship quality between children and their pet dogs. And then I will talk a little bit about the biological mechanisms of social attachment as they relate to human dog interaction, but also specific to kids and their pet dogs. And finally, I will discuss how we currently study social attachment between children and their pet dogs in our lab at Harvard and how we use a dyadic approach to do so. But to start us off, I want to talk about the fact that pets are important to us. So consider this. In 2023, in the US, we spent $147 billion on pet services. And at the time, there were 65 million US households that owned a pet dog, which is about 45% of households. So and at the bottom here, you can see a breakdown of the spending, but this is a lot of money that we people have poured into our pets. So what I hope this highlights for you is the fact that we care a lot about our pets. We care enough about them that we are pouring billions of dollars into them every year. But dogs are of specific importance to us out of all pets. So if you can think back to the lonely times of the pandemic, people were feeling increased loneliness, people were socially isolated, and you might also remember that there was an increase in dog adoption rates during the pandemic as well. And there were even some shelters that were showing on social media that they were completely empty for the first time ever. So, this is probably not a coincidence that when people were in their peak feeling of loneliness, they turned to dogs. And, pandemic aside, this also shows how social support through these canine friendships improves human health. So, we touched on loneliness, but there are several other factors that pet ownership, specifically dog ownership, can have on human health and well-being. So just to name a few, we know that there are studies that show that having a pet dog can help to improve one's heart rate. It can also increase physical activity, which is somewhat intuitive. If you think about having a pet dog, you're probably walking the dog. And if you didn't have the pet dog, you may not be going on as frequent walks. There are also increases in social interactions with pet dogs. So, for instance, adults who are walking their dog through the neighborhood, they are running into neighbors more frequently, making those social connections, or perhaps going to dog parks and meeting people at dog parks and making connections there. So there's this increased possibility for social interaction through pet dog ownership. But also, this comes with reductions in anxiety and reductions in stress. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, reduced feelings of loneliness. So, studies support each of these factors that can occur with pet dog ownership. So, these are just some of the ways in which owning a pet dog can help to improve human health and well-being. But those studies focused on adults. I will also want to highlight that dogs are really important for children as well, not just adults. There are studies that show that kids also have an increase in physical activity with dog ownership. There's one study that even found kids who walked their dogs more also tended to play outside more and would show more independence than children who did not walk their dog. We also know that there's a study that found kids show improvements in reading ability when they're able to read out loud to a dog, especially in the classroom. But they also showed improvements in learning when spending time training the dog, and even when the dog was just passively pleasant and present in the classroom. And then when we think about households that have infants, there's a study that showed households with infants, those infants were at lower risk for experiencing developmental delays if there was a pet dog in the household. And then there's several studies that show there are several mental health improvements for children who have pet dogs, including some of the ones that we talked about before with human adults, such as reductions in loneliness, reductions in anxiety, and also reductions in stress. So you may have noticed there is some existing evidence of improvements in physical and mental health and well-being in households that have children and dogs. And some of these are the same as what we see in human adults. But there's another aspect here that I believe is understudied and could have value when we talk about the relationship that forms between children and their pet dogs. So I want to talk about the importance of relationship quality. So what I mean by this is that relationship strength may matter for observing the best health outcomes. So we know that in general, dog ownership can yield positive health outcomes in adults and in kids. But there is this idea that there may be more benefit for individuals who have stronger relationships with their pet dogs compared to individuals who don't have as strong of an attachment to their pet dog. So I'm going to go through a few different examples that support this idea, examples of some studies that have found that the strength of one's social attachment to their pet dog matters. So to start, there was a study that found that there was a significant correlation between empathy scores on a survey of developmental measures and also attachment scores. So this suggests that the attachment level that a child had with their pet was more important than the passive presence of that pet alone. So we see this relationship between increased attachment and increased empathy scores. There's another study that found on a different survey called the Companion Animal Bonding Scale that higher attachment levels were related to increases in physical activity. And so this shows, once again, that it's not just the passive presence of a dog in the house, but the actual attachment level experienced by the child towards the dog that matters for seeing this positive physical health outcome in kids. And then there's another study that found higher attachment levels yielded more walking of the dog compared to kids that had lower attachment levels with their dog. So yet again, we see that greater levels of attachment are associated with greater physical health outcomes. But we also see these mental health outcomes, as I talked about in the first example. So we're getting a hint that the relationship quality between a child and a dog might matter. Another example, children that showed high levels of attachment to their dog scored themselves higher on perceived health and happiness compared to kids with lower attachment scores. So this is a self-report study, but it shows that children who considered themselves to have a greater attachment to their dog also considered themselves to be happier and healthier. And, oops. Another study with slightly older kids showed that kids who had a stronger attachment to their pet dog had more confidence than those with weaker attachments. So if we were to summarize what I just talked about, we have learned that there are a few studies supporting this idea that the relationship quality between a child and their dog matters. So having a stronger social attachment or a social bond or a stronger friendship to your dog if you are a child leads to all kinds of increases in physical and mental health and well-being. So just to summarize, I've put age here. So in 3 to 6 year olds, we see increases in empathy scores with strong attachments to pet dogs. In 4 to 10 year olds, we see increases in physical activity. 9 to 10 year olds, we see increased dog walking. So that's a more specific kind of physical activity. 8 to 12 year olds, we see increases in confidence, and 11 to 15 year olds, we see increases in reported health and happiness. So across the board, it seems like the level of attachment that a child has to their pet dog could be really important in obtaining those mental and physical health benefits of pet ownership, over and above just having a pet in the house that one may or may not be very attached to. So this is an important idea. And social attachment formation, based on all of this, is likely relevant for those therapeutic effects to emerge in a maximally effective way. So not just having a dog, but having a relationship with the dog to have the best benefits from pet dog ownership. So it's increasingly common to use dogs for therapeutic purposes with children. One way, which I talked about briefly, was reading. So sometimes dogs come and do classroom visits with children, but there are also programs at public libraries that invite dogs to come in, and children can practice reading to the dogs in libraries. Another example is some pediatric dental offices are starting to bring dogs in so that the whole dental experience is less stressful to children. And then dogs also frequent hospitals to visit children. So I'm thinking of the Boston Children's Hospital near where I live, but I'm sure there's plenty of hospitals that have programs that bring dogs through to visit children and adults alike. But now I'd like to talk a little bit about the biological mechanisms of attachment. So before I dive in, for those of you who haven't taken a biology class in a little while, I just wanted to refresh your memory because I'm going to be talking about hormones. So I wanted to just define hormone for you. So hormones are chemical messengers that travel through the bloodstream. They travel through other fluids within the body to affect our emotions, mood, and behavior, among other things. And social attachment in general has been well studied in mammals, and it essentially involves a hormone called oxytocin. And oxytocin is a hormone that is generally associated with increases in attachment behavior, increases in social bonding, social affiliation. And that's the context that we're going to be talking about oxytocin in today. You may have heard about oxytocin in pop science, referred to as the love hormone, and oxytocin is implicated in a lot of other things outside of social attachment, but for the purposes of this particular webinar, I'm just going to focus on the role that oxytocin plays in social attachment and social bonding. And then the other hormone that you're going to hear me talk about is called cortisol. Cortisol is a hormone that is associated with stress. It is also produced in the brain. And I'm in a little bit later, I'm going to talk about a predicted relationship between oxytocin and cortisol. But for now, all you need to know is that higher cortisol levels tend to be associated with higher levels of stress, and higher oxytocin levels tend to be associated with higher levels of social attachment. Okay, so the oxytocin system interacts with brain areas that are involved in emotion and attachment. And in this diagram, you can see some of those areas here. So the color of the brain area, so this is a dog brain on this side and a human brain on this side. So the brain is oriented such that if this is the human profile, their face is facing this way. So the eyes and the face would be here, and this is the back of the head. I'm not sure actually if you can see my mouse as I'm dragging it over the screen, but I hope you can. And then the dog's brain is here, so it's oriented as if the dog's nose was on this side and the back of the dog's head would be over here. Um, just to orient you. So each of these colorful circles corresponds with the color of the brain area down here. You don't have to be super familiar with neuroscience to appreciate these areas, but what I want you to take away from this diagram is that there are certain areas that are specifically involved in emotion regulation and social attachment. And there's other areas like reward processing areas that we can see are sometimes involved in these processes as well. And a lot of these brain areas are actually activated in human mothers when they are viewing images of their human children, but also when they're viewing images of their family dog's face, which is very fun. But it also suggests to us that this oxytocin system is involved in social attachment formation on a neural level, both in human relationships and human dog relationships, at least in adults. So another interesting thing to keep in mind is that oxytocin is the proposed hormonal mechanism by which humans and dogs co-evolved to form strong social bonds in the first place. So as you can see here, there's this idea that increases in oxytocin are associated with decreases in cortisol. So having stronger social affiliations and social bonds are associated with having lower levels of stress. And that's something that I will talk about right now. So there's this idea that, as I said, oxytocin helps us to reduce stress, possibly through the reduction of cortisol levels. And there is a hypothesis called the social buffering hypothesis, which suggests that social support or social attachment can help to protect an individual from the negative effects that stress can have on the body. And we do find evidence in favor of this hypothesis in human adults, as well as in human parents and their children. So that relationship, the parent-child relationship. But we don't know if we would observe evidence in favor of the social buffering hypothesis in children and their pet dogs. So we've not looked at this from an interspecies perspective. But we do know that stress can have very detrimental effects in pre-adolescence, and these effects can last well into adulthood. So if there's a way that we can learn how to manage this stress or buffer it completely, such as through these strong relationships that children can form with their pet dogs, then that would greatly benefit children and child health and well-being. So there is some evidence that kids might experience social buffering from having a dog. So for instance, there's a study that found that during a social stress test, kids reported feeling less stressed when they were in the presence of their dog in comparison to conditions where they were just with their parent or they were alone without their dog. So what this tells us is that from self-reports, kids were feeling less stressed when they were with their dog compared to when they were without their dog. There was another study in which kids showed reductions in cortisol levels. So remember, cortisol is that hormone that is typically associated with stress. So kids were showing reduced levels of cortisol after interacting with their dog. And the greatest reductions in cortisol occurred when kids were strongly attached to their dog. So what this tells us is that stress levels, when viewed through this biological, physiological lens, seemed to be reduced after kids were interacting with their dog. So having a dog was helpful and beneficial, but the kids who had a strong attachment to their dog were the ones who benefited the most. They saw the most stress reduction. So what this suggests is that child-dog interactions can reduce stress and act as a social buffer, especially when attachment levels are more pronounced between the child and their dog. So we know that social bond formation is an interactive process. It is a dyadic process, meaning that there are two individuals involved. There's a child and there's a dog, so there's a pair, so there's a dyad involved, and each of the interactors' behaviors influences the others. So, for this reason, it's really important for us to evaluate the biological mechanisms of attachment in both the child but also the dog, because it's possible that if, say, the dog fails to form a strong attachment or any attachment towards the child, then this imbalance in the relationship could inhibit or stop bond formation between the two from reaching its full potential, and it could prevent stress buffering effects from occurring. So that's why it's important for us to pay attention to the mechanisms. So, when we're talking about biological mechanisms, we're talking about hormones, we're talking about the brain, so neural mechanisms as well, but also behavior. So, all of these elements are really important to understand bond formation on behalf of the child, but also on behalf of the dog, especially in this interspecies context where we aren't just looking at two children bonded to each other or a parent bonded to their child, but we're looking at a child bonding to a dog. So, how can we measure stress and attachment in kids and dogs? And I've discussed this, but hopefully you've caught on that there are a few different ways. Um, we can look at social behavior. So, how are kids and dogs interacting when they're around each other? Are there behavioral indicators of attachment that we can measure in a quantifiable way? We can also talk about hormonal mechanisms. So, we were talking about oxytocin, how the hormone oxytocin is involved in social attachment. Cortisol, the stress hormone, maybe there's a relationship between oxytocin and cortisol that we can measure. And then finally, the neural mechanisms that we talked about a little bit. But are there measurable differences in brain activity when kids are more or less attached to their dog and when dogs are more or less attached to their child? So now I'm going to talk about the work that we are currently working on in our lab that is trying to do exactly this, which is to measure stress and attachment in kids and their pet dogs in hopes of figuring out how to best maximize the therapeutic beneficial outcomes of child-dog attachment that we know can be possible. And we do this in three ways. The first way is through behavior measures. The second way is through hormone measures. And the third way is by looking at the brain. So I'd like to start by talking about our behavioral measures. So we give families a couple of surveys to complete. Families who participate in our study are asked to complete the Lexington Attachment to Pets Scale. So this is a survey. It's very short. It's only 23 questions. And we ask the kids to fill this survey out. And it's a survey that really just evaluates the child's perspective of their attachment to their dog. Then we have the parents fill out the CBARQ, which is the Canine Behavioral Assessment and Research Questionnaire. This is a standardized questionnaire that is used very commonly throughout really the canine cognition field, and a lot of CBARQ survey measures have been found to correlate with all kinds of behavior measures, cognitive measures, even some neural and genetic measures as well. But in the CBARQ, there are 14 behavioral and temperament subscales, which include an attachment subscale as well as separation subscales, which are relevant for our current study. Then we have the dog personality questionnaire. This is another one that parents fill out. It has some similarities with the CBARQ, but it evaluates items such as fearfulness, aggression, excitability, trainability, etc. So we start with these surveys, and then we ask participants to come to the lab with their pet dog, and we ask them to participate in a modified strange situation test. So the strange situation test was originally designed to tell us about attachment behavior between mothers and infants, but it has since been modified to use with humans and their pet dogs. And it's been used in this way across many different studies. So the test is pretty simple. It is essentially a series of separation and reunion events that occur. These separation and reunion events are meant to mimic separation and reunion events that happen in everyday life. So, for instance, when children go off to school, they are separated from their dog for a period of time, but then they come home from school and they're reunited with their dog. So, we try to replicate these reunions and separations, but on a much smaller scale. So, we have this is our lab space. Kids will come in with their dogs, and every 3 minutes there's a new condition. So sometimes the child will be in the room, but the dog will not. Sometimes the dog will be in the room, but the child will not. And then they'll be reunited in the next condition, and so on and so forth. So these are meant to be naturalistic ways of having the child interact with their dog just on a smaller scale than what they actually experience in real life. So you can see here, there's chairs for the kids to sit in. The dog is free to roam around the room, and there's always a researcher in the room with the child at all times. But we film all of our sessions so that we can later score and code certain behaviors of interest. So we are interested in looking at attention-seeking behaviors. How often is the child trying to summon or get attention from their dog? How often is the dog seeking attention from their child? We look at physical contact. How long, so as you can see here, the participant is in physical contact with their dog. How long do they stay in physical contact with each other? When does the dog walk away and leave the child, if at all? How much time are they spending in proximity? So the child's sitting in the chair, but the dog is free to roam. How much time is the dog choosing to spend next to their child? We look at head orientation. So where is the child focusing most of their attention? Where is the dog spending most of their attention? Is the dog constantly oriented towards the door, towards the child? And then we also pay attention to how the dogs act upon reuniting with their child. So there's all of these different behaviors that we will look for after these behavior sessions are complete. And then we take this qualitative data and then we code the videos so that we can turn it into quantitative data so that we can run different statistical analyses with them. So there's another issue here, which is that this setup doesn't quite allow us to get at the question about whether the level of social attachment is what could be responsible for any stress reduction behaviors that we might see. So in order to fix that issue, we want to make sure that we can answer that, what if it's the presence of a dog alone and not the attachment level that's important for affecting stress? So for participants who come to our lab with their pet dog, we actually also ask them to complete the strange situation test with a therapy dog as well. We try to match therapy dogs for sex, breed, weight, and age of the pet dog as best as we can. And we have been working with a group called Dog Bones in Massachusetts, in Boston, but there's therapy dog groups outside of this one as well that have sometimes participated. And having kids complete this with a therapy dog who they've never met and have no relationship to, alongside of the session with their pet dog who they have some relationship to, helps us to determine whether it's really just having a dog in the room that matters, or if the dog needs to be one that the child is attached to and familiar with in helping for stress reduction. So those are our behavior measures of focus. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about our hormone measures. So as I mentioned before, we talked about what hormones are, chemical messengers that are important. What I may not have mentioned before is that the nice thing about cortisol and oxytocin, which we discussed, is that both of them are measurable from saliva in kids and in dogs. So we can take saliva samples from kids and saliva samples from dogs, and then we can measure levels of cortisol and levels of oxytocin in each of those samples. So throughout our behavior tests, we collect samples at different time points. Um, so at baseline, when kids arrive to the lab with their pet dog, post separation, so after one of those separation events that I was talking about before, we collect another sample. And then finally, after the child is reunited with their dog, we collect a final sample so that we can look at cortisol and oxytocin, so changes in stress, changes in um, attachment, those hormones we can measure from these saliva samples. And finally, I'd like to talk about our neural mechanisms that we're interested in. So we're talking about the brain. As I mentioned before, there are some areas of the brain that are related to emotion, attachment, and reward processing that we expect to be important for this particular study. And some of these same brain areas that are involved in emotion, attachment, and reward processing happened to activate when mothers view images of their children and of their pet dogs, as I mentioned before, which I think is a really fun study. But we also know that there's evidence that oxytocin inhibits brain areas that control the stress response, meaning oxytocin seems to be having this dampening effect or this reducing effect of cortisol or stress on the brain. So for those of you who have not seen an MRI image before, these are my brain, the human brain, and then this is a dog brain. So here you can see the orientation. My face is on this side. It would be the same for the dog. The dog's face would be on this side with their nose here, and then the brainstem going into their spinal cord this way. So there are, and you may have understood this from the previous diagram that I showed, but there are brain areas in the human brain and the dog brain that do correspond to each other. Obviously, you can see there are a lot of differences in the human brain. So the human brain has more folds than the dog brain does. It's also a lot bigger, which I'll show you another video in a few slides. But so there are differences, but I do want you to know that there are enough similarities to draw these kinds of comparisons. So all of our neuroimaging takes place at the Center for Brain Science at Harvard University. The kids that come in with their pet dogs will do their MRIs here, and their dog will do their MRI here as well. And when we invite kids to participate, they actually get the opportunity to watch videos of their own dog while they're in the scanner, and they watch videos of whichever therapy dog that they met that day while they're watching or while they're in the scanner. So they watch both of these videos, and then that allows us to make comparisons of their brain activity when viewing each of these different kinds of videos. And then when the kid is done with their session, the dog gets a chance to go in the MRI. And although the dogs are lightly sedated for their MRI, there's evidence to suggest dogs can still perceive odors even in that state. And so we expose dogs to the odor of their familiar child's t-shirt and also to the odor of an unfamiliar person's t-shirt. So we can compare brain activity in a similar way that we look at the child's brain activity. We'll be doing the same thing with the dogs, but with scent instead of visual cues. And I just wanted to show you this little example video of what we see when dogs are in the scanner. So these are the different views of the brain. I'm sorry, it's a little bit choppy, it looks like, but just to give you an idea. So mainly looking at this one here, this is the 3D rendering of a dog brain, and it's kind of just being spun around. I'm going to play it again briefly, but so this piece in the middle here is the brain. And then everything else is non-brain. So you can see the eyeballs. If you look at this image up here, you can see the muscle that surrounds the brain. So you can kind of get a sense. I think this was a yellow lab maybe that was in the scanner, and you can get a sense for how big the dog's head is compared to their brain. Their brain is maybe the size of, I want to say, a large lemon. whereas the human brain is much bigger than that. So just to give you a size comparison of what to expect from the dog brain after they come in for these scans. So let's see. So this is how we measure stress and attachment in kids and their pet dogs. So we have our behavior measures, we have our hormone measures, and we have our brain measures. And this is where I would like to call on any junior citizen scientists who are out there. We would love to have them participate. So anyone who has kids that are between the ages of 7 and 13 who think that this kind of study sounds really awesome and who are interested in learning about science, participating in science, we'd love to invite you to our lab. We have a website that you can visit, caninebraids.org, or you can follow this link directly. You could consider filling out our pre-registration survey to see if your child and your dog would be eligible to participate. We offer $100 for people who come to participate in the study, and it's a really great experience for young kids to get exposure to a real science lab that they are participating in. You're never too young to be exposed to science. And it's a fun way for kids to contribute and learn about dog science in general. You must be willing to travel to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where our lab is located. But yeah, if you could please spread the word to anybody who has a kid who might be interested, age 7 to 13. We are actively collecting data still for a little bit longer. And for those of you who think this work is interesting, but you may not have kids in this age range, but you're still interested in contributing to canine science, check out our lab website. If you go to the Participate tab, you'll see all the different studies that you can help contribute to. Even for those of you who might be international, there are different survey studies that you can participate in as well. We have an Instagram page if you don't already follow it, and a Facebook page as well if you want to follow any updates from our lab. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for attending tonight, and I'd be happy to answer any questions from the Q&A if there are any.
So nobody's pasted anything into the chat yet. Does anybody have any questions?
And if not, I believe the people who are here right now have access to my email. If you think of any questions later, feel free to email me, and I'm happy to answer them that way as well. Give another minute or two for questions, but if there's no questions, then thank you all for coming. I appreciate
Yeah,
it.
thank you all very much. Oh wait, hang on. I think maybe I might be seeing something. Aha, Q&A. Okay. All right. So do you have any sense of whether there is a potential risk that a child can be affected negatively if their relationship with a dog is antagonistic? For example, if the child is encouraged to punish or scold the dog.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so that's actually a really good point that I did not make, but I'm glad you asked. Um, yes, so this is not necessarily a one size fits all situation, especially when kids are involved, especially younger kids who may not, who may still be learning how to have a relationship with their pet dog. Especially in an antagonistic way, if that's the case for the individual. So it's always important, especially for young kids, for there to be adults monitoring relationships between kids and dogs. The older kids, it's less critical, but especially early on. Um, I don't know off the top of my head if there's data to support negative outcomes on kids who don't have um, as positive relationship with their dog, or who the dog maybe is fearful of the child because of the way the child acts towards the dog. Um, But, there are instances that I could see this being less beneficial. I don't want to say negative because I don't know that there would be, um, I mean, unless maybe the dog is biting the child, that would be negative, but I would say probably less beneficial. But I also want to take the time to say that there are instances. So if you don't have a dog and you've watched this webinar and you have a kid, maybe you're thinking, wow, I should really get a pet dog. There's so many benefits to having a pet dog. There can be benefits, but if your child is not interested in dogs or is afraid of dogs or is allergic to dogs, there are reasons to not get a pet dog. So I do want to make that clear as well, because I think a lot of people can learn about all of the benefits that come with pet dog ownership and sort of forget about the reality that not every kid is suited for a dog. Not every kid wants a dog. So that's important to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, that's a good point too. I think, this is probably a concern for a very small fraction of responsible pet owners, but the most common, from my understanding, the most common victim of severe dog bites are young children. Um, that happens when parents aren't explaining to children how to interact with dogs. So like the person who asked the question said, if the child is being encouraged to punish the dog, like punish by hitting the dog or something like that, that could lead to that type of outcome. So
Right.
sort of responsible guidance about how to act around a dog is part of the common sense management of that situation.
Yeah, I think a lot of dog relinquishments too, back to shelters, can come from instances where a dog lashes out at a child. I think a lot of times it happens with young kids because families might have a dog and then they have a kid after having the dog, and then the dog has an incident with the child, and that leads to them having to give up the dog. So, yeah, to reiterate what you said, it's important for there to be some healthy examples of how to interact with the dog and then boundaries around the dog. A lot of dogs won't tolerate people or other dogs near their food, for instance. So maybe don't let your toddler near the dog food when the dog is eating out of the bowl, things like that, to try to mitigate risk and prevent dog bites and things from occurring.
Yeah, okay. So next question is, have you seen a breed preference for differing levels of social attachment?
In the current study, no. But we've also had a variety of breeds and not quite enough representation from each of the breeds that we've seen to do a strong statistical comparison of breeds, at least in my case. But in other studies, I don't, off the top of my head, know of any breeds that as a whole are more prone to forming stronger social attachments, if I'm interpreting the question correctly. Um, I think that any dog is capable of forming an attachment, but yeah, I guess specific to our current study, the answer is not yet.
Yeah, I think that's my understanding as well. I'm not aware either of any research that's shown that some breeds are less or more likely to form an attachment.
I think there's other factors besides breed that can be more predictive of that.
Yeah. Okay, and then the next question, what was the biggest surprise that came to you?
The biggest surprise. Hmm. I have been surprised by the different, there's been a lot of variety in the way that the children have a relationship with their dog. And I think anecdotally that these relationships are different because of the different personalities of the children. Um, so it's been fun and interesting to witness the kids interacting with their dogs because they are all a little bit different, which has been fun.
Yeah, I've heard some stories of some of these these
Yeah.
characters. Um, okay, and what is the current sample size for the study?
Um, so we've had a lot of interest. Um, I I don't remember the specific number of people that have reached out, but there's been, I want to say close to 60 who have gotten in touch about this study. We've been able to bring in about 11 in person so far. And we're hoping to bring more in. So we're working our way through, but if anyone is interested, we still have space. Um, just fill out the pre-registration form and we will get in touch to let you know if your child and your dog would be eligible.
Okay. And then the final question was, will the webinar be posted online?
That's a good question.
I guess I can answer that one.
Aaron can answer that one, yeah.
Since I manage our website, yes, it will be posted
Okay.
on our website. If you go to I think it's the publications page, you can see our previous webinars there, and we'll put this one there too.
And it's possible that people who registered might get an email with the link as well. I'm not sure, but if not, now we know it will be online.
Yep. Okay. Great. If there's any other questions, please feel free to ask them. Okay, it seems like that might be it.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Olivia. That was a fantastic webinar.
Thank you.
All right. Well, have a good night, everyone.
All right.